All right, we're a couple minutes past the hour. Why don't we go ahead and get started here? Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tevora's webinar, Third-Party Risk Management Best Practices. My name is Matt Fullerton, and I'm an account manager with Tevora. Today, however, we'll be hearing from a couple of Tevora's experts in our third-party risk management practice, Vivi Huang and Katie Elias. Vivi and Katie have a wealth of experience with TPRM, and they've implemented and currently operate third-party risk management programs for many of our clients. If you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and use that chat function there in GoToMeeting, and we will be sure to address them at the end of the presentation. But before we dive in, just a little background. Here at Tevora, we're a consultancy focused entirely on information security, compliance, and risk management. We offer a huge range of services like security assessments, penetration tests. We also act as a VAR to help with solution selection and implementation. We can help with any compliance frameworks that you align with, like SOC, ISO, HIPAA, FedRAMP, HITRUST, and much more. We also have a privacy practice dedicated to helping with all of the regional privacy regulations like GDPR and CCPA. Tevora is also certified by the PCI Council as both a qualified security assessor, QSA, and as a PCI forensic investigator. We're one of only 12 in America. We've been in business for over 18 years, and we work with companies of all sizes, all the way from startups to Fortune 500s. That was just a very quick, brief overview on who we are here at Tevora. Katie, Vivi, why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much, Matt. Again, my name is Katie. I'm so happy that you can join us today. I am an information security associate on the third-party services team. Here with me, I have Vivi.
Hi, my name is Vivi Huang. I'm also a third-party services team member, along with Katie.
And as Matt mentioned, together we work on implementing, building, maintenance, etc., of third-party risk management, TPRM, programs for many clients. I would say on any given week, at the bare minimum, we have at least 10 assessments and are maintaining around 5 to 7 TPRM programs for different clients. Obviously, this all depends on the time of year. Is it the top of the quarter, the start of the year, etc. A little bit about Tevora. I think that Matt covered all of it, but we cover a wide range of topics, and we are a certified 3PAO, and a lot more information can be found on our website, and feel free to check that out. Now, today we will be covering third-party risk management best practices. So a little bit about what we'll be talking about. So with data breaches becoming more and more prevalent, we see them in the news. It feels like a new one every week. But with many organizations finding themselves at the mercy of their security of their third-party vendors, and they are outsourcing because they are reliant on experts in the field, and it's part of becoming a competitive business. Through third-party products, applications, and services, these are all risk to business. That's why a third-party risk management program is so important. Organizations can be subject to supply chain attacks where, criminals are targeting those fragile networks and infrastructures. Third-party programs aim to prevent incidents and data leaks that happen via third-party vendors. This might be a vendor that already has access to your organization's data and systems, or it might be a vendor that you're trying to onboard. Either way, at its core, a successful TPRM program provides an understanding of the risk associated with outsourcing. I like to say you're only as strong as your weakest link, and your chain is your supply chain. So a really great example of just how important this is NIST 853's recent revision, Rev 5, that has a whole section dedicated solely to supply chain management. I think that this is really considered to be a much needed and long overdue adjustment to reflect the industry's dependence on third-party vendors. So, yeah.
Yep. So in order to have a good TPRM program, you really want strong fundamentals. And one of the major aspects of program fundamentals are your key stakeholders. So these are the people who are really driving your program, and they're going to be your support throughout the entire process. So your internal business partners will be the persons who want to enlist a vendor for their services. And these persons, they can go under many different names. Some people call them the contract owner or the business owner or a partner, but really they're your liaison between your organization and the vendor point of contact. Katie will discuss more of this later during the common challenges section, but we do encounter a lot of vendors who are non-responsive, and they'll only really talk to the business partner. So really utilize them within the process. Another important stakeholder would be procurement, the department or the person who's procuring the vendors. There's also legal, very important for creating those contracts and having all those requirements set prior to accepting any contracts or creating contracts between your organization and the vendor. Privacy, if your organization needs to adhere to certain compliance or privacy frameworks such as GDPR or LGPD, CCPA. There's also risk assessment or the security team, the team that will be developing your questionnaires, assessing your questionnaires, assisting your vendors going through remediation, etc. And of course, the vendor point of contact. They're the star of the program, and you don't want them to feel like they're being subject to an audit or that they'll be penalized for not meeting security requirements. You want them to know that they're part of your team and that this is a mutually beneficial relationship. So you really want all of these key stakeholders to be aligned with each other and to work together throughout this whole process. Kitty and I have actually encountered a situation with a client, a very big organization, that went through a change of key stakeholders during our process. So we had the questionnaire designed, we had a flow map developed, but because of the change in key stakeholders, there was a misalignment, and then we had to go all the way back to the drawing board and redo a lot of the questionnaires and the process design. So we really want all of these persons aligned with each other and to make sure that you're on the same team. Yep. So just like how organizations need to take inventory of their important assets, like their equipment, you also want to take inventory of your vendors. And you'll be really surprised by how many organizations don't know all the vendors that they're using. So in order to take inventory of your vendors, there's 4 different ways you can do it. You can follow the money. So if you're paying someone to do something, then chances are they're a vendor, and you want them to be part of your vendor risk management process. Another thing you can do is to check all your contracts. If you have a centralized contract repository or software that keeps track of all your contracts, that's great. Or you can double check with all your departments to see what contracts they're using, just in case maybe your departments work isolated of each other. There's also, you do need to double check with certain individuals who may have access to a company credit card. Maybe they're using vendors that haven't gone through a more formal procurement or onboarding process. So definitely double check with your departments and your vendors and ask, what contracts are they have in place. Third is technology. There's a lot of technology available for you to use. And if you have data flow maps, that's really helpful as well. If you see a large amount of data flowing to a certain service, that can kind of tell you hey, maybe someone's using a service or a vendor for that reason, you know. And earlier I mentioned, you know, follow the money, but there could be a case where one of your personnel or your departments is using a freemium service. You know, they think, oh, it's free, so they're not really a vendor. But nothing is really free. There might be some kind of catch, or they might be using your data for certain reasons. So definitely double check to see if any freemium services are using, and try to determine whether they should be part of your third-party risk management program. And fourth is, you know, use a business survey. Ask your personnel and departments what vendors are using, you know, what data does that vendor have access to, etc. So once you take an inventory of all of your vendors or your third parties, you want to tier them in terms of criticality. This way you can help manage or have them go through the TPRM program differently, so that you're not wasting your resources on vendors that perhaps aren't as critical. For example, you might have a cloud service provider. You want them to go through the process because you really want to make sure that everything is, all the security requirements are there. But on the other hand, you might have a coffee provider, you know, which is very important, of course, to your company. But if they have a security incident, it might not have as much of an effect on your organization than the cloud service provider. So when you're tiering these vendors, you can send them different surveys or personalized questionnaires so that you're not wasting, you know, 300 questions or all the time and energy assessing a coffee vendor as opposed to a cloud service provider. So we've provided 5 questions for you that you can ask to help tier these vendors, such as, do they hold your company's data, or do they hold your client's data? Are they connected to your network? You know, do they host or develop any applications for you? Do they have physical access to your facilities? What's the impact to your critical business operations? So asking these questions, you know, whether they say yes or no, they can help tier the vendors accordingly. And on this slide, we show 4 tiers, but it can be any amount of tiers, and you don't have to call it 1, 2, 3. Of course, you can say ABC. The name isn't too important as long as you're really tiering and categorizing the vendors accordingly so that you can use your resources wisely.
Great, thank you, Baby. So once you have taken stock of who you're working with and who's involved, you can start to kind of lay out your foundations. And the 3 pillars of your foundation are really going to consist of your information security policy, your contracts, and your questionnaires. You want to put everything in writing, and this is your time to be preemptive and proactive. So you want to think about all of the things that might come up along the way. You want to start to reduce the questions that might come up later on down the road so that you really can take on the individual situations that do come up. You want to reduce all of that. So you're going to have your information security policy and your contracts, and all of this should be reflected within your assessments and your questionnaires. If it's not on paper, then how do you really know where your legal standing is, who is responsible, what are the obligations here? A great example that I will probably bring up a few times is, how soon after an incident do you want to be notified by your vendor? This is all stuff that maybe within your contract that's defined within that with that vendor, but also within your security policy, you might have that defined depending on a certain amount of criteria. And then in your contract or in your questionnaire, you can verify, you know, double check. It's really a great opportunity to double check, and everything should really reflect and support each other here. In an ideal situation, this all works on paper, right? But within your organization, but you also want it to work on paper with your vendor's organization. So a sample design process is a great way to start making sure it works on paper with your organization. This is an example. This really paints a picture and defines a workflow. It gets everybody on the same page, if you will. It pinpoints decision points. It defines responsibilities. It gives you a map of what your process will look like, a clear image of which directions you can go with. It also is an opportunity for you to see where you could simplify things. Can you strengthen, one point or a certain area? And you can start to get an idea of what timing will look like. It gives you an idea beforehand. There's nothing left to chance. You're really preemptive here. So one thing I mentioned earlier was questionnaires. Questionnaires are really inevitable throughout this process, whether that's onboarding or assessments, procurement, etc. So it's an opportunity for you to flow down requirements. So where do you start? You start by thinking, what industry are you guys working within? Is GDPR relevant? Is PCI, DFARS, BAA? Those are prime examples. And if you're not within any of those, you want to think about maybe working off of a popular compliance framework, maybe something by NIST. It's a really great place to start. And then you can start to tailor that to your organization and to your vendors because they provide really great minimum requirements for how you ask a question, but also what answers you're hoping to get back from your vendors. Your questionnaire should also integrate with all of the items found with your agreements with your vendors. Does it align with your information security program? You might have multiple questionnaires. This is something that we run into a lot. Just like Vivi said, you're not going to have the same massive, in-depth, insightful questionnaire that you would send to a vendor that has critical business infrastructure and is imperative to your day-to-day business, rather than, a coffee vendor where, yes, they are critical to daily operation, but they're not going to have the same impact that a large service provider would have. You want to really take this opportunity to not leave anything to chance. You want to be one step ahead. You want to be proactive with your vulnerability and your risk management here. So just throughout our process of developing questionnaires, I would like to really present this example of how this can play out. You want to take this opportunity to balance automation versus insight. So with all the tools and all the ways to implement this is going to come down to how you ask the questions within your questionnaire. And this could also depend on tiering. So what I'm getting at here is an example question might be, do you perform penetration testing regularly? It's a very legitimate, very important question. And possible answers might be yes or no. And that's a really great way to automate. Do you have automated risk flagging associated with the answers that they provide? It doesn't really provide a lot of insight, and insight might not be necessary. But if you have a more critical vendor, you might want to rephrase that question to ask, how often and how do you perform penetration testing? That gives you a lot more insight, and it really takes away the opportunity that the other phrasing of the question might present for automation. It might take more resources in assessing those, and that's something you want to consider, because once you've sent these questionnaires out, you get to the process of assessment and possibly remediation. So you want to think about also inherent versus residual risk. Working with a service provider, they might be handling your data regularly, but that's why you hired them. So that's inherent risk. But if they're not performing penetration testing regularly, that would be residual risk. And in your information security policy, you have already defined what your approval criteria are, what your thresholds are, and this might lead you to granting approvals not approvals. Conditional approval is something that Vivi and I run into a lot. It's an opportunity for that business relationship to really come into play because you're working with this vendor and it might be a process of back and forth and tracking misalignments and how do we reduce that gap between with the misalignment. This introduces also follow-up timelines. Those might be different for conditional approvals, but also approvals present follow-up timelines. You will have assessments and reassessments. And the most important thing to keep in mind here is this TPRM process is not a set it and forget it. What happens if your vendor changes internally or their services change or their infrastructure? It's so important, not just from a compliance standpoint, but from a risk and vulnerability management standpoint, that you really have this cycle and this relationship and this continued growth within the TPRM space.
Great. So we just went through a bit of information. So a quick recap regarding the program fundamentals. First, you want to know your key stakeholders and make sure they're aligned and working together. You want to know your third parties and tier them accordingly. You want to make sure that your fundamentals, such as your contracts, your questionnaires, and your information security policies are reflective of each other and support each other. When you're developing questionnaires, you want to try to base it on perhaps a strong framework or an industry requirement or regulations. And also you want to make sure that you have an assessment or remediation process in place. So you're not just assessing the vendors and then forgetting about them, but that you're actually following up and working together with them to strengthen their security posture. So after you've developed those program fundamentals, how will you implement the TPRM program? What are some solutions that you can go for? Well, there's sort of three ways you can go about it. First is in-house management. In-house third-party risk management is where your organization would take care of everything. And that way you would have control over the vendor relationships. But that does take a bit of resources and personnel. So you might want to consider shared management style of service. So where you would outsource certain parts of the program or certain processes to another organization. Or you can outsource the entire TPRM program to another organization. So they could build, develop, and maintain it for you, or they can build it for you and go through the process. But regardless of which solution style you go for, you might want to consider different tools as well. So different solutions or different tools in order to help support your TPRM program. Some things to consider when you're implementing new tools is whether they integrate well with your existing technology. So perhaps you have Azure directory or you have AWS. Does it work well with that? Or does the native APIs work well with your environment? Will your key stakeholders be able to use it easily? Or do you have to go through, a month, 2 months of training just to understand how that tool works? Another point is realistic expectations, for license usage. You might think, oh, well, I have 1,000 vendors, so I'll buy 1,000 licenses. But in the end, you might only end up using, 600 of the licenses. So you want to try to avoid that kind of situation, by having realistic expectations. Regardless of these points or what type of tool you use, you really want to be sure that the tool you're using should support your business process rather than define it. So you remember the swim lane process that we showed earlier, the sample design process? You really want to avoid having a tool that overrides everything. So have a tool that helps support the process. So there are different categories of third-party risk tools. You have rating tools such as Security Scorecard or BitSight that gives vendors, a grade, A, B, or C. Is it strong? Is it weak, etc. There's also exchange type of tools such as OneTrust, Vendor Insight, Cyber, GRX that help you exchange documents or questionnaires between you and the vendor. There's also process management tools. For example, Prevalent, maybe RSA Archer, ServiceNow, that help you manage the process of third-party risk management. Of course, there are tools that do a little bit of all three or just one or two, but there's really no magic tool that does everything. And if it does, it probably costs a lot of money. So definitely consider the resources your organization has available. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the process that you've already designed. And also Katie mentioned a really good point about automation versus insight. Is there a tool out there that can help automate the process? Actually, Katie and I, for one of our clients, we use Excel, Microsoft Excel to monitor risks. So I'm sure there are tools out there that can help with risk monitoring, but the client didn't have those resources available to use those tools. So Excel is, an example of something that doesn't provide a lot of automation, but it can help with insight and such.
Great, thank you. So with all of this, the prep and the foundation, and you try to be as preemptive as possible, you still really run into some challenges. They're inevitable. The TPRM building and implementation process is really challenging for any organization. So here are some of the common things that we run into, and I would just like to go over them quickly. So something we've seen is a large service provider that won't complete a questionnaire. It happens, some of these bigger organizations aren't going to take their time and resources to sit down and fill out your questionnaire. So that's a time where you really want to consider alternative evidence that might be acceptable, and that might be in the form of a SIG or SIG-Lite or a SOC 2 report, where you take your time and resources to dive in and get your, into that information and map it against your questionnaire. It might be a compliance, certification that you have decided that map, aligns with your requirements and is acceptable. Something else that we have seen is maybe an executive who really wants to bypass the review process. And that's something to think about. And you need to really consider how you're handling the risk here and think about, getting all those stakeholders, having them buy in on this process from the beginning, and documenting the whole process accordingly. Another scenario that a vendor doesn't meet all of our expectations. It happens. But because you've already defined your thresholds within your information security policy, your contracts, and then you verified it through your questionnaires, this is where we've seen a lot of conditional approval options. And that's where you get this business relationship in the picture, and you work with the vendor and the client, and you are working on that together. It's not one person or one organization against another. It's really that relationship coming into play. That leads really well into the scenario where maybe a vendor is unresponsive, and we run into that quite a bit. We've seen actually in reality how much it helps to get that business relationship working here. Just like Vivi said, sometimes, a vendor might only respond to the business owner, and having that that conversation and working together is really invaluable. And sometimes you might get to a point where you really need to reevaluate that vendor, and if you want to renew the contract and decide if that's the risk that you are willing to take on, time and resources, etc. Maybe a vendor doesn't use the same terminology. You know, holding those phone calls, I know I keep going back to the same solution, but we've seen how much this really helps. But having those conversations and those meetings and really making sure that everybody's on the same page is invaluable. Some vendors might be a tiny company or a single employee. They don't have that huge business organization behind them. And that's an opportunity for an organization to see them more as a contractor and see that relationship kind of shift to be more appropriate for, more appropriate, reflect the reality of the relationship. A vendor and business owner not being on the same page, there might be complete misalignment and misunderstanding as to what data they're handling or what services they're providing. You'd be surprised how many times we have run into that. And, a way that we have looked out for that is through our questionnaires, just some little double checking of our understanding and their understanding, business owners' understanding, making sure that everybody's on the same page, because again, that's a really, really imperative part of the foundation of this TPRM process. Obviously, remediation goes back to, again, that business relationship and conversations and really getting aligned again. This leads us to Tevora's approach. We start off with laying out that foundation, designing everything, having our policy, what are we going to do, how are we going to do it, putting everything on paper and aligning all of the parties involved. From there, we can start to build. Are we leveraging tools? How are we doing it? Start to build that stuff out, and then we can take that to operations. Let's get this off the ground. Let's get this out there. Let's start, sending out our questionnaires, evaluations. That way we can have our status reports and our, start to see where most of our risk lies and things like that. Now, from there, we can have the option of transferring this operation back to your organization, or we can work on it together, or we can completely operate it and keep it going. Either way, we are going to go through more or less these 4 phases. And a sample timeline might look something like this, just to give a little bit of context. Obviously, this all depends on the size of your organization and how many vendors are coming into play and the responsiveness of vendors and how many questionnaires. There's a lot of variables here. But just as a kind of general idea, all in all, developing a successful TPRM program can be challenging for any organization. And with the continuous advancement of virtual commerce, it has placed a huge, huge pressure on organizations to conduct secure business practices. And this is where Tevora comes into play. We strive to help clients form those strong TPRM programs that reduce risk created by outsourcing to third-party vendors. Carefully assessing and monitoring vendors partnered with addressing necessary governance processes and technological advances. All of this comes together to really create a strong and successful TPRM program. Thank you again so much for joining us today. Do we have any questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, one question came in while you guys were chatting. How do we navigate between stakeholders and third-party vendors when nobody's being responsive enough? What's the final ultimatum? What does that look like? Do you recommend? Well, why don't you take it from there?
Sure. I think we've had this come up recently with a vendor that we are working with. Just it slows down the process a lot, and it can be really frustrating. I think that it's really important to communicate and have the buy-in of your executives and your stakeholders, and making sure that, I mean, I know getting started, it's having a lot of vendors grandfathered in, but going forward, really not using vendors that haven't gone through the process. You want to make sure that you're not taking on risk as an organization without being fully aware and being fully accountable and intentional with that risk.
Yes, and definitely utilize, the SLAs that you've created earlier, and really go back or go up the chain a bit. If, say, even the business owner isn't responsive, you might have to rope in the executive. This is supposed to be a mutually beneficial relationship. If they're not being, responsive, then it's might not be as beneficial if they're unresponsive.
Excellent, thank you. One other question just came in just now. I think this is someone who's building a third-party risk management program and feeling a little overwhelmed by the number of vendors that they're looking at, perhaps. So what's the ideal number of personnel to get a third-party risk management program kind of off the ground?
Wow, I think that depends on a lot of things, right? Your timing, I think thinking about timing and resources, they go hand in hand. I think that slow and steady is a lot better. Once you have those foundations, you don't want to take on too many vendors at once because that will require more resources. So I'm like a broken record. I'm like, that business relationship is so important. So if you maybe have that business relationship with your vendors, you could start with 1 or 2 vendors, go to 5. And that way you can really maintain that kind of close business relationship. You don't need maybe as many vendors. I think it depends on your timing, and that directly feeds into resources.
Yes, and it really depends on the number of vendors you have as well. So if, say, you're not as big of an organization, you don't have a lot of personnel to spare, you might want to consider outsourcing the TPRM program, especially if you don't really know what you're doing and you have a lot of vendors to go through. So unfortunately, we can't give you a magic number like, oh, you want 1 personnel per 3 vendors, because it really depends on how many vendors you have and what type of vendors you have.
I would say that working with Vivi on some of these TPRM programs and maintaining them, building them, all of that, it really also, as you add in more to those, more people involved in maintaining or building, you really want to think about how you're going to implement seamless processes between the personnel and your resources. That's something that we work really hard at, and it's not easy, but having that seamless transition, if it's me working on something and her working on something, some kind of project management, sometimes we use Excel, sometimes, there's a bunch of other tools, but the seamlessness between us is really something that we work hard at.
Wonderful, thank you. Those are all the questions from the audience at this time.
Great, thank you so much.
Yep, and if you have any other questions after this, you can reach out to us via our contact on the slide or through LinkedIn as well.
Thank you so much for attending today. We're happy to have you guys with us and for hearing what we have to say.
Yep, thank you.